Before we begin this story, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the mysteries that still need to be revealed. Here, each account hides secrets that many would prefer to keep buried. Feel free to leave a comment below. Where are you watching from? Your city, your country? Sometimes the quietest places hold the most disturbing stories. The narrow asphalt road seemed forgotten by time. Ancient trees encroached upon the path, as if trying to swallow it, forming a dark corridor that led to an isolated spot in the American countryside. At the end of this road, the property appeared. A house far too large for the place, surrounded by vast, uneven and silent land. Iron gates remained closed, covered in rust and signs of neglect. The windows, sealed with thick boards and crooked nails, gave the building the appearance of something that should no longer be seen or opened. Ethan Carter watched everything from inside the parked car, lacking the immediate courage to get out. He wasn't a superstitious man, but there was something about that house that stirred a discomfort difficult to explain. The air seemed heavier there. No birdsong, no wind rustling through the leaves. Just silence, a silence that pressed against his ears and made it clear that the place hid something. Ethan had returned to that region after more than 15 years away. He had grown up in small towns, accustomed to rumors, poorly told stories, and secrets that never appeared in the newspapers. But that house had always been different. Even as a child, everyone knew that one shouldn't pass by it after sunset. Not by explicit orders, but by a silent agreement among the residents. There were places that were better left forgotten. The conflict that brought him back wasn't just professional, nor just personal. It was both. Ethan worked as an independent investigator, specializing in abandoned properties, embroiled in murky legal disputes. The house had reappeared in recent records after decades without any legal activity. No known heirs, no sale, no clear explanation as to why it had been sealed off in that way. But there was something more. The name linked to the property had surfaced in an old file that Ethan had sworn never to consult again. A name associated with an episode hushed up by local authorities. A case closed too quickly, missing persons, incomplete reports, photographs that never reached the public. The antagonist in that story didn't present itself as a person of flesh and blood, at least not yet. It manifested itself in the very structure of the house, in the decisions made in the past to keep it closed, in the collective effort to erase any trace of what had occurred there. Whoever had sealed those windows hadn't done so to protect the interior from the world, but to protect the world from what was inside. Ethan got out of the car and walked slowly to the gates. The iron creaked slightly under the touch, as if reacting to human presence after years of neglect. Old padlocks hung loosely, corroded, but still closed. It wasn't carelessness, it was intentional. That house had been locked away, never to be accessed again. He didn't try to force his way in at that moment. He preferred to observe. The surrounding terrain showed signs of something hastily interrupted. Tools half buried in the ground, old tire tracks, a shed in the background with its door hanging crooked. Everything indicated that someone had left in a hurry and never returned. The mystery lay not only in what had happened, but in why everyone had agreed to forget. Ethan knew that secrets of this magnitude required complicity. Authorities, residents, altered records. The house was not just a site of tragedy, it was a silent pact made to keep a truth buried. As the sun began to hide behind the trees, Ethan felt an uneasy certainty that this investigation would not follow conventional paths. There would be more than just documents and interviews. There was something there that had withstood the test of time, waiting, and the simple act of returning had already shattered a fragile balance maintained for decades. He walked away from the gates with the distinct feeling of being watched, not by visible eyes, but by the very memory of that place. The house remained motionless, sealed, yet alive in a way that defied rational explanation. And, unknowingly, Ethan had taken the first step toward reopening a secret that should never have been touched. In the days following his first visit to the property, Ethan Carter immersed himself in the quiet routine of the nearby small town. The place maintained the typical appearance of the American countryside. Streets too wide for the flow of cars, old facades, gas stations that seemed to exist only out of habit. But behind the normality, there was a latent discomfort. People observed too much. They spoke too little. Ethan quickly realized that the name of the property was not spoken. Simply mentioning the house at the end of the road was enough to change everyone's expressions. Some looked away, others ended the conversation abruptly. It wasn't ordinary fear, it was a dread cultivated over generations, passed down as an inheritance. The setting reinforced this feeling. Municipal archives operated in an old building, with metal shelves full of yellowed boxes. Many records from before the 1990s were incomplete or strangely rearranged. Dates were swapped. Pages were missing. Ethan didn't need immediate proof to understand that someone had tampered with them. It was in this environment that the first secondary characters emerged. The local librarian, a middle-aged woman named Margaret Hale, displayed excessive, almost defensive politeness. While helping Ethan locate old newspapers, she carefully avoided any addition that mentioned disappearances, fires, or criminal investigations in the area. It wasn't incompetence, it was a choice. Another name began to appear repeatedly in the records: Daniel Moore. Former owner of the house, reclusive businessman. No recent photographs, no interviews, only indirect references, always associated with unusual construction, renovations and purchases made decades ago. Large quantities of wood, steel and fencing materials, all legal, all documented, but never explained. The house was no longer just a residence, it had become a project, a planned isolation. Ethan began observing the residents' behavior when the subject of this past came up. There was a pattern. Everyone knew something, but each person only knew a fragment. A noisy night, a truck seen at dawn, a strange smell in the air for days. None of these pieces in isolation seemed relevant. Together, they suggested an event that had never been officially recorded. The antagonism of the story took shape not in a present individual, but in the collective memory molded by silence. There was no evident villain, only repeated decisions not to speak, not to record, not to investigate. The entire city functioned as an extension of the house, closed, sealed, protecting something within. Ethan also began to feel the personal weight of that investigation. He recognized patterns similar to those of an old case that had marked the beginning of his career. At the time, he had accepted superficial explanations. Now he realized how much institutional silence could be as violent as an explicit crime. The environment directly influenced his decisions. Each closed door pushed him further into the isolated house. Each incomplete file reinforced the need to return to the starting point. The setting was not merely a backdrop, it was an active agent, shaping the investigation, imposing invisible limits. The property itself began to be observed more closely. Ethan walked around the grounds during the day, noticing details previously overlooked. Marks in the ground, suggesting underground constructions, strangely irregular vegetation, as if the earth had been turned over several times over the years. The shed in the back contained abandoned objects, but nothing broken. Everything had been left behind in haste, not carelessly. Daniel Moore ceased to be just an old name and became an indirect presence. His choices had shaped not only that house, but the behavior of the entire city. A man who had built something that required the silent collaboration of many to remain hidden. Ethan understood then that he wasn't dealing with just an architectural or legal mystery. It was a secret held by ordinary people who chose to survive rather than confront the truth. And that choice, repeated over the years, had created something bigger and more dangerous than any single crime. At the end of that in-depth exploration, one certainty became clear. To understand what had really happened, Ethan would have to break more than just old locks. He would have to confront memories, challenge silent pacts, and enter a place that everyone had agreed to keep closed, not out of forgetfulness but out of necessity. Ethan's investigation ceased to be merely silent when signs of resistance began to emerge. These weren't direct confrontations, nor explicit threats. They were small, carefully placed obstacles, as if someone were testing how far he would go. A requested file would disappear before being consulted. A contact who had agreed to speak would change their mind hours later. Even access to the house's grounds was subtly hampered by patrols not listed on any official schedule. None of this was a coincidence. Ethan realized he had crossed an invisible line. Someone, or more than one person, was watching his movements. The city, previously only silent, had become attentive. He felt the stares when he entered a cafe, the sudden cessation of conversations when he approached. The conflict was not declared, but it was established. To continue meant defying a collective agreement of silence. Determined to move forward, Ethan decided to act outside of normal hours. He returned to the property at night, parking away from the main road. The darkness seemed denser there, as if the house absorbed any nearby light. Using simple tools, he managed to remove one of the side padlocks from the gate. Not without effort, not without resistance. The iron gave way with a dry crack, too loud for the silence of the place. Inside the grounds, the conflict took on a different form. There were no obvious signs of ordinary abandonment. The ground was too clean in certain places, as if it had been swept years after the official closure. Traces of old footsteps still visible in the hardened earth suggested frequent comings and goings over a prolonged period. Someone had returned there after the supposed abandonment. As he approached the house, Ethan noticed something unsettling. Some of the window boards had been recently replaced. The wood was newer, the nails less rusted. This wasn't routine maintenance. It was reinforcement. Whatever was being protected still required care. Inside, after forcing a side entrance, the air was heavy, stifling, and permeated with a metallic odor that was difficult to identify. The conflict was now physical. Every step required effort. Every decision seemed to carry an immediate risk. The floor creaked under the weight of decades. Objects remained exactly where they had been left. Covered furniture, photographs turned face down, clocks stopped at the same time. Ethan found clear evidence that the house had not been evacuated peacefully. Marks on the walls, deep scratches in the wood, interior doors locked from the outside. There were no signs of open fighting, but of containment, of something that had needed to be kept in a confined space. Ethan's internal conflict intensified. He could no longer pretend he was only dealing with records and old stories. The house reacted to his presence, not in an explicitly supernatural way, but with a silent hostility. Every room seemed laden with intention. Tension rose when he found a staircase leading to the basement. The door had been reinforced with metal bars installed after the house's original construction. This wasn't part of the initial design. It had been added out of necessity. Ethan didn't open it then, but he knew that was where the conflict lay. As he left the property near dawn, he found something new. Recent tire tracks near the gate. They weren't his. Someone had been there that very night. The conflict was no longer just in the past. It had become present, active, vigilant. From that point on, Ethan understood that every advance would have a cost. The mystery reacted, the city reacted, and above all, what had been sealed in that house was not as inert as everyone believed. As the investigation progressed, Ethan realized that the mystery of the house didn't stand alone. It branched out into smaller stories, subtly interwoven, forming a web of shared decisions, omissions, and blame. Each subplot added weight to the main conflict, making it clear that the secret wasn't the responsibility of a single person. One of these layers came through Margaret Hale. Until then, just a cautious librarian, she began to show clear signs of inner conflict. In brief encounters, her hands trembled as she sorted through old newspapers, and her gaze remained fixed on the door, as if she feared being seen. Without offering direct explanations, she began leaving small clippings on Ethan's desk, never the most incriminating ones, but enough to indicate that she knew more than she was saying. Her subplot wasn't one of villainy, but of survival. Margaret had grown up hearing that certain truths destroy entire communities when they come to light. Another parallel line emerged with the shed at the back of the property. Ethan returned to the site during the day and found, under the partially detached floorboards, an improvised compartment. Inside, there were old clothes, dust-covered boots, and a metal box containing personal documents of people who had officially never lived there. Names without records, photographs without dates. This indicated that the house had been used as a temporary residence or detention point. The complexity increased when Ethan cross-referenced information and discovered that some of these names matched temporary workers who had passed through the city and disappeared without any formal investigation. No known family ties, no complaints filed. People easy to erase. Time became a pressing factor. A legal process was about to be reopened due to the property's reappearance in state records. If that happened, outside authorities would be involved, and the quiet control maintained by the city could crumble. This urgency explained the recent reinforcements at the house and the increased surveillance of Ethan. Meanwhile, a subplot emerged involving the former local sheriff. Now retired and living a reclusive life, his name discreetly appeared on old permits related to the property. Ethan tried to contact him, but encountered only indirect resistance. A note left under the door simply stated, "Some doors have been closed to prevent worse things from happening." There was no threat there, just a warning laden with guilt. All these subplots converged on the same point. The house had not been sealed by a single event, but by a succession of decisions made to avoid something considered uncontrollable. The secret was not only deadly for what it had caused, but for what it could cause if it came to light. Ethan felt the weight of these parallel stories squeezing his options. The closer he got to the truth, the more people would be exposed. Each breakthrough represented not only personal risk, but the collapse of a community built on omissions. The tension remained constant, without unnecessary explosions. The clock ticked, the trial drew near, and the house remained there, motionless, waiting. All the subplots pointed to the reinforced basement, the place where the past, fear, and complicity converged. Ethan understood that there would be no way to separate the main mystery from the smaller stories. Solving one would require confronting them all. And, with time running out, he knew that the next decision would irreversibly change the course of everything. The irreversible change began almost imperceptibly. There was no explosion, no shouting, no chasing. There was only a decision made, too late to be undone. Ethan returned home at nightfall, aware that this would be the last time before outside forces, lawyers, state officials, journalists, were inevitably drawn to the place. The time pressure had become suffocating. The legal process was progressing, and someone was clearly trying to buy time by reinforcing the house's structure. It no longer made sense as simple protection of the past. It was continuous containment. He entered without difficulty. The side door had remained partially ajar since his last visit. Inside, the silence seemed different. No longer empty, but expectant, as if the house knew that this night would not be like any other. Ethan went straight to the basement. The reinforced door was ajar. That small, devastating detail changed everything. The metal bars had been recently removed, and the padlock lay on the floor, broken from the inside. Someone had been there after Ethan's last visit, not to reinforce the lock, but to open it. As we descended the stairs, the smell became almost unbearable. It wasn't just mold or neglect. There was something organic, ancient, and persistent ingrained in the walls. The lighting revealed a much larger space than expected. The basement had been expanded over the years, excavated manually, with makeshift partitions and interior doors designed to be locked from the outside. The turning point wasn't the discovery of the space, but what it revealed. The house hadn't been sealed off after a single event. It had been used continuously. Ethan found detailed records, notebooks, timestamps, crossed-out names, observations about behavior, resistance, silence. This wasn't impulsive violence, but a method, a system sustained by someone with resources, influence, and indirect support. The most disturbing revelation came when it was realized that the dates extended far beyond the period officially recognized as abandonment. Some entries were less than 10 years old, others only months. The antagonist, until then vague, finally took shape. It wasn't just Daniel Moore, it was a continuity, a legacy maintained by successors, people who believed they were protecting something greater even while perpetuating the horror. The real breaking point came when Ethan heard a sound above, footsteps, slow, careful. There was no longer any doubt that he was not alone. He hid between the partitions and watched. A figure descended the steps with unsettling familiarity. There was no hurry, no hesitation. That person knew the place, knew exactly where to step, what to avoid, what to check. When the light revealed the face, Ethan recognized someone who should never have been there. He wasn't a stranger. He was someone connected to official records, someone who had helped maintain the silence, someone who symbolized the city's normalcy. At that moment, the mystery ceased to be historical and became immediate. It was no longer a matter of discovering what had happened, but of surviving what was still happening. The house held more than just an ancient secret. It held a living system, and Ethan had just entered its center. Ethan remained motionless, controlling his breathing as the figure moved through the basement. Every gesture was calculated, almost ritualistic. There was no hurry, only verification. The impact of the revelation still throbbed in his mind. This was not an isolated crime from the past, but a cog that continued to function. When the person left the basement, Ethan waited for several long minutes before moving. The silence returned, heavier than before. The consequences of what he had discovered began to impose themselves with brutal clarity. Gathering evidence was no longer enough. There was now a concrete and immediate threat. He had been seen entering the property that night. Of that there was no doubt. His anonymity was over. Leaving the house before dawn, Ethan found clear signs of reaction. The car had been ransacked. Nothing was taken, but everything had been moved. A silent warning. Someone wanted him to know he was being watched, that his every step would be closely monitored. The city reacted in an equally subtle way. Margaret Hale didn't show up for work the next day. The former sheriff, previously just a recluse, moved away temporarily. Files that Ethan had photographed disappeared from their original locations. The consequences weren't explosive, but systematic, a quick, coordinated, efficient cleanup. Ethan felt the isolation growing. Outside contacts began to avoid calls. A state attorney, who had initially shown interest in the case, backed down without explanation. The system reacted by closing ranks, protecting itself. This confirmed what Ethan feared. The secret involved more people than he could face alone at that moment. On an emotional level, the transformation was immediate. Professional curiosity gave way to an ethical urgency. He knew that retreating would mean allowing the continuation of something that had never ceased. Moving forward, on the other hand, put his life at real risk. This tension shaped every subsequent decision. The house now took on a new meaning. It was not only the epicenter of the mystery, but a symbol of the consequences of collective silence. Each reaction from the city reinforced that the closure of that property had been an active choice, renewed over the years. Ethan began to act with extreme caution. He started making physical and digital copies of the records he found, hiding them in separate locations. He was preparing not only to reveal the truth, but to ensure that it would outlive him, if necessary. The consequences also manifested themselves psychologically. Ethan felt the constant presence of surveillance. He didn't need to see it to know it existed. The pressure didn't come from direct threats, but from the certainty that any mistake would be definitive. At the end of this stage, Ethan understood that the point of no return had been passed. The city had reacted, the system had moved, and he was now part of the active conflict, no longer as an observer but as a target. The truth remained there, sealed by layers of fear and complicity, but unlike before, it now had someone willing to confront it, even if the cost was too high to predict. The change in Ethan didn't happen abruptly, but it became visible in the way he began to act. Previously meticulous and cautious, he now operated with a quiet precision, aware that every decision needed to be final. Fear hadn't disappeared. It had simply ceased to paralyze him. It had become a tool. Ethan left the city for a few days, not as an escape, but as a strategy. He settled in a roadside motel, far from urban centers, where the constant movement of truckers made any surveillance more difficult. There, he reorganized everything he had collected: photographs of the basement, copies of notebooks, lists of names erased from official records. For the first time, he saw the complete picture. It wasn't just a local system. There were patterns that indicated replication elsewhere, albeit on a smaller scale. This understanding marked his growth. He stopped thinking only about resolving that specific case and began to see what needed to be dismantled. The house was the most visible symbol, but not the only one. The real challenge was to expose the mechanism that allowed it to continue existing under the guise of normality. Back in the city, Ethan changed his approach. Instead of confronting directly, he began to create fissures, small leaks of information to the right people at calculated moments. Not enough to reveal everything, but enough to generate unease. He had learned that systems based on silence collapse when they lose predictability. His growth also manifested itself in his relationships with others. When Margaret Hale reappeared, more dejected and less careful, Ethan didn't demand answers. He offered indirect protection. He showed her that there were alternatives besides fear. That simple choice made her finally confirm something essential: the basement had never been empty. There had been periods of inactivity, but never complete abandonment. The protagonist also began accepting help, something he had avoided throughout his career. A former colleague from independent investigations was contacted, someone from outside the area, without local ties, not to solve everything, but to ensure redundancy. Ethan's growth lay in understanding that resisting alone was exactly what the system expected. Internally, the transformation was reflected in firmer actions. He stopped questioning whether he should continue. Doubt had been replaced by responsibility. It was no longer a matter of curiosity or abstract justice, but of preventing the continuation of something concrete and active. The learning process was tough, but effective. Ethan understood that he wouldn't win by directly confronting the still hidden antagonist. He needed to force him to react visibly, to expose his existence, to make a return to comfortable silence impossible. By the end of this stage, Ethan was a different man from the one who had first arrived at the isolated road. No longer just a researcher, but someone willing to sacrifice his own safety to break a cycle that had been sustained for decades. Overcoming fear wasn't about eliminating it, but about acting despite it. And now, prepared, Ethan knew the final confrontation was approaching, not by chance, but as a direct consequence of everything he had learned. The following days were marked by a fast pace, with no room for hesitation. Ethan knew that time was working against him. The fissures he had created were beginning to generate movement, and movement in systems based on silence always produced errors. The first subplot to conclude was that of the former sheriff. Pressured by rumors that were beginning to circulate and fearing that his name would surface uncontrollably, he left town for good. Before leaving, however, he anonymously delivered an envelope to the motel where Ethan was staying. Inside were copies of old permits and a rudimentary map of the property, with markings that went beyond the known basement, tunnels, extensions, spaces that never appeared on official plans. The message was clear: the house hid more than Ethan had seen. At the same time, Margaret Hale ensured that the last manipulated records were copied before they disappeared completely. With that, the subplot of institutional omission came to an end, not with redemption, but with a belated gesture of responsibility. Tension grew as more visible reactions began to emerge. Unknown vehicles began circulating at night. Lights were briefly seen in the sealed house, something that had never happened before. The system, once discreet, was being forced to move hastily. Ethan decided that the climax couldn't occur on neutral ground. It had to be in the house, not just for symbolism, but because that's where the final evidence and the physical center of the mechanism were located. He chose a specific night, when an external inspection was scheduled to take place days later. That would force the antagonist to act before control was lost. The preparation was meticulous. Ethan installed simple recording devices at strategic points on the terrain, not to capture everything, but enough to make it impossible to deny what would happen. He knew he didn't need perfection. He needed irrefutable evidence. The emotional climate reflected this acceleration. There was no longer room for prolonged reflection. Each action propelled the story forward. Each step brought the inevitable confrontation closer. Upon returning home that night, Ethan felt the weight of everything that had been built up until then. The silence was no longer defensive. It was tense, on the verge of breaking. The sealed windows seemed less like protection and more like a prison, for those inside or below. The final subplots were coming together. The complicity of the city, the legacy of Daniel Moore, the continuity of the system, and Ethan's transformation converged at that single point. Everything that had remained fragmented was now organizing itself towards a single narrative explosion. Ethan walked through the open gate, knowing there would be no going back to the way things were before. The house was awake, and for the first time exposed. The climax would not simply be a physical confrontation or a shocking revelation. It would be the collision between decades of silence and the impossibility of maintaining it for another night. The night was strangely clear as Ethan crossed the property grounds. There was no full moon, but the sky seemed to reflect a pale light, enough to reveal every contour of the house. The sealed windows no longer conveyed isolation. They seemed to contain something pressing to get out. He entered without resistance. The main door was unlocked. This, in itself, was confirmation that the confrontation had been accepted. Inside, the air seemed to move, as if invisible currents circulated through the corridors. Almost imperceptible sounds echoed from the walls, not like voices, but like activity. The house wasn't empty, it was functioning. Ethan went straight to the basement, ignoring the other rooms. The stairs creaked under his feet, but there was no attempt at surprise. Whoever was there wanted to be found. Upon reaching the lower level, he realized the space had been reorganized. Internal doors were open, partitions were removed. What had once seemed like a containment area now took the form of an improvised operations center. Generator-powered lights illuminated maps, metal boxes and tables covered with recent documents. And then the figure appeared. There was no acting, just presence. An ordinary man, neutral appearance, posture too calm for that environment. Someone who would go unnoticed anywhere. He didn't try to hide or attack. He simply observed Ethan as if he had been waiting for that moment for a long time. The revelation was direct, without elaborate speeches. The system had never depended on a single name. Daniel Moore had only been the initiator. The true climax lay in the realization that continuity had been ensured by people who believed they were maintaining order. They selected, isolated, and erased. Not out of sadism, but out of distorted conviction. Tension soared when Ethan revealed that everything was being recorded. The man reacted, not with panic but with urgency. He tried to shut down the generators, destroy the records, activate underground escape routes. It was there that Ethan's transformation became visible. He didn't hesitate. He anticipated every move. He blocked exits. He forced the antagonist to act openly. The physical confrontation was brief, chaotic, and silent. There were no final words or emotional justifications, just the direct collision between someone who believed they were protecting a system and someone willing to destroy it. The real impact came when other sounds echoed through the tunnels. It wasn't just one person, it never had been. External lights flooded the space as Ethan's devices performed their function. Vehicles approached, voices, external authorities, automatically alerted by the signals he had programmed. The silence of decades was finally broken. Cornered, the antagonist attempted one last desperate act to destroy what remained of the basement. But it was too late. Everything was exposed, recorded, undeniable. In the midst of the controlled chaos, Ethan realized that he had won not through force, but through transformation. He hadn't just sought answers. He had created a point of no return. The climax was not the fall of one man, but the collapse of an entire system, ripped from the shadows at the very moment it tried to survive. Dawn found the property unrecognizable. Not because of its physical structure. The house remained standing, silent, motionless, but because of what now surrounded it. Vehicles, technical teams, and external agents occupied the land that had remained untouched for decades. The secret was no longer protected by isolation. It was exposed to the harsh light of reality. Ethan watched everything from a distance, exhausted but alert. There was no clear sense of victory. What he felt was the weight of the consequences finally materializing. People being removed from the site, sealed boxes, mapped tunnels. Each action confirmed that the system had not only existed, but had functioned for far too long. The city reacted as expected. Public shock, initial denial, hasty attempts at dissociation. Many claimed to know nothing. Others alleged they had been deceived, but the records, images, and testimonies easily dismantled these defenses. The collective silence had left too many traces to be sustained. Margaret Hale was one of the few who didn't try to hide. She gave a full statement. She didn't seek acquittal, only relief. The former sheriff, located days later, was also called to account. The responsibility, previously diluted, now had names, positions, and signatures. As for the house, it was officially closed off, not to be forgotten, but to be studied. What had been sealed to conceal became evidence. The place came to symbolize something greater than the horror it had harbored. The ease with which systems perpetuate themselves when no one decides to stop them. Ethan handed over all the collected material and refused extensive interviews. He didn't want to turn the case into a spectacle. He knew the story would run its course without him. His role had been to push the truth out of the darkness, nothing more than that. As he left the city, he passed again along the narrow road between the trees. For the first time, the silence didn't seem oppressive. There were still unanswered questions, faces that would never be identified, damage impossible to repair. But the cycle had been broken. The conclusion offered neither complete comfort nor absolute closure. It offered something rarer, the certainty that the secret would not remain alive, and sometimes that was the most you could achieve. Months later, the house remained isolated, now surrounded by official signs and constant surveillance. No renovations had begun. No demolition had been authorized. The place had become a point suspended in time, no longer a secret, but also not fully understood. Ethan followed the latest updates on the case from a distance. Some names came to light, others remained hidden, protected by agreements and legal limitations. The truth had emerged, but not completely. it never came. In one of the seized boxes, an unsigned note caught the eye: "Closed gates only work as long as no one asks why." Ethan kept the phrase to himself, aware that not all systems had been dismantled, only the most visible one. Somewhere, other doors remained sealed, and now, someone knew they existed. Stories like this don't exist merely for entertainment. They remind us of how many truths remain hidden not for lack of evidence, but for lack of questioning. How many gates remain closed simply because everyone has accepted that they should remain that way. If this account has sparked unease, curiosity, or discomfort, please share your thoughts. Do you believe that collective silence can be as dangerous as direct action? To what extent can a community justify hiding the truth in the name of order? Leave a comment, tell us what caught your attention the most, and say, would you have followed through to the end like Ethan, or would you have backed down when the risk became real? If you enjoyed this story, stay tuned for the next ones. There are still many forgotten places, many sealed secrets, and not all are willing to remain hidden forever.